Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's event that is part of the King's Africa Week events titled Therapy Through Art with the NEEM Foundation and the Institute of Psychology, Psychiatry, and Neurosciences at King's College. In today's event, we have two discussants who I will introduce to you shortly. But really the event focuses on the NEEM Foundation, who will be presenting a series of images that display art that are used to provide mental health and psychosocial support to survivors of violent insurgency in the northeast of Nigeria. I'll just say a little bit about the NEEM Foundation. It is a foundation leading crisis response organization committed to promoting the protection and well-being of populations and communities living in contexts affected by conflict, violence, and fragility, and is a research partner with the King's African Leadership Center, as well as the Institute of Psychology, Psychiatry, and Neurosciences, hence the partnership that we have today. In a little while, I will invite Dr. Mark Abie Iruya Yenema, who is a socio-cognitive psychologist working on preventing and countering violent extremism and is strategic communications expert, and he will be presenting the work of NEEM. And we will have responding or also contributing to the conversation today, Dr. Charlie Parfitis, sorry for my mispronunciation. I did ask you how to pronounce it correctly. Please do forgive me for any errors. But Dr. Charlie is a research fellow at IOPPN here at King's College London. She was a senior lecturer in community engagement and philosophy at Rhodes University from 2014 to 2019. And in 2016, she was awarded the Vice Chancellor's Distinguished Award Medal for her critical public health work in Southern Africa. And as I've already said, she's currently a research fellow here at King's College London. So I will be handing over now to Dr. Mark. The format of our conversation today, because it will be a conversation and an interaction, we will see a video that that has been prepared by the NEEM Foundation. We will have Dr. Mark Abie say a couple of remarks following the video. We will then come to Dr. Charlie, who will also make some inputs, and at which point we will open the floor for conversation, for discussion, for contribution. Please feel free to use the Q&A box as well as the chat box for any questions or comments you may have throughout our engagement, and we'll have an opportunity to come to those and interact more with our two discussants as we proceed. So Dr. Abie, I think we can go ahead to show the video. Is that fine?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Wonderful. So thank you so much, Adeoti. Over to you.
In this short video, I'm going to briefly speak about our approach to mental health and peace building through the use of art. Now, it's important to note that the approaches that I will mention here are complementary to our other more sustained efforts. For instance, the expressive therapies, the art therapy, the psychodrama, dance, and so forth are complementary to our more sustained individual and group therapy sessions. And the peace murals and the communities that I will mention towards the end of the video are complementary to our more sustained trauma-informed and inclusive peace-building activities with community stakeholders and community members. Now, before I proceed to the pictures, it's important to note that viewer discretion is advised. Given that we walk in the context of conflict, some of the pictures might be upsetting to some viewers.
How do you communicate with young children who have undergone traumatic experiences? How do you get them to articulate the contents of their thoughts and dreams without words? How do you get them to participate in therapy when they do not wish to speak? Here at NEEM, we have found the use of art therapy to be particularly useful when working with children, employed through various techniques. For instance, in this exercise, children draw random lines on a large piece of paper. And from this random scribble, we ask them to look closely and make out the shapes that they can see. Over and over again, we see them draw images related to conflict. Here, we can see a dead body in the middle among various household items. And it's no different for the girls. In this image, we see dead bodies in red, an axe and a decapitated head, is one of the girls informed. Similarly, we can see a drawing here from a little girl once held captive by Boko Haram. We see to the left guns and knives, and a bag of blood, a decapitated head. And to the right, we see her drawing a terrorist with a gun. Now, these activities will usually be followed up with other more common activities in talk and group therapy. Through another approach, we tell children to draw a past experience prominent in their minds. Here, we see the drawing of a terrorist beheading the girl's father. In this other frame, we see the child's murdered parents and a sibling. In this frame, we see terrorists approaching the village. Here, we see a dead body on the floor. And here, they spot a terrorist on their way back from the farm. Now, the next stage in this exercise is that we tell the children to draw their present states. Here, we see a child sitting by a tree, another child receiving counseling, another child outdoors with an adult, a girl at school with friends, and another girl at school, but standing apart from the other girls playing. And the final part of this technique, we ask the children to draw an imagined future. This girl wants to be a soldier to revenge. This other girl wants to be a doctor to help people. This boy wants to have a house and a car. This girl also wants to own a big home of her own. And this child wants to be a teacher. Through these exercises, we have also identified a number of children who are keen on joining the army to avenge the death of their parents. Now, joining the military is a noble and patriotic engagement. However, if a little child is consumed by hatred and revenge and wishes to join the military for personal revenge, we spot an opportunity to work with that specific child to address his or her anger or grievance by firstly validating their feelings and then seeking ways to address it and build their resilience. How do you get women to speak about various forms of abuse in their homes, including physical, sexual, and emotional? How do you get them to speak about rape? How do you get them to speak about sensitive issues, which, if attributed to them, can lead to stigmatization and discrimination for them and for their families? We use psychodrama to address many of these issues. We involve women in the scripting of the plays and character development. Over and over again, we find them correcting us with the dialogue and action. They would say, no, it happens this way, or no, the uncle will come that way. Women and men in communities put on these plays for themselves and by themselves, speaking to no one in particular, but to everyone in general, speaking about their plight specifically through the third person. And in several of these plays, I have seen some community members, culprits or not, sit uncomfortably on their seats. And I once heard a man say, these people, they expose us, meaning these people are exposing us. To which I smiled uncontrollably. And we dance too, as a form of expressive therapy. Do you know how joyous it is to light a smile on the faces of these resilient people? How much more laughter? We also use a lot of mindfulness exercises to get individuals to focus on sensing and feeling the present. In addition to the breathing exercises used to center participants, we get participants to focus on the moment by utilizing the long tradition of repetitive creative action. Coloring mandalas, for instance, distracts our conscious attention away from ourselves, away from the stress and anxiety, to focus on the present, to focus on the task at hand. What we have done differently is to contextualize this activity to our own reality, utilizing cultural and traditional relevant practices and products. In Nigeria, we have what we call Bama hats or Hausa hats. These hats are also widespread throughout sub-Saharan Africa. It is an intricately embroidered hat that takes between 2 to 5 weeks to make by hand. In Nigeria, the creation of the hat is popularly traced to Bama. Bama is one of the regions worst hit by the violent insurgency and has a significant percentage of its indigents currently displaced. The hats have traditional and cultural significance in the whole of present-day northern Nigeria and are worn widely by a cross-section of Nigerians. What we have done in our contextualization of repetitive mindfulness techniques is to embed this cultural practice of embroidery into our psychosocial support delivery. We yet go one step further by also embedding peace messages in their embroidered hats in different dialects spoken in the community. For instance, this hat shows justice in Hausa and Kanuri, as well as in English. Similarly, we also work with community members to practice the repetitive exercise of knitting hand fans. This activity is not only engaged in and enjoyed by women, but also by men who find it somewhat amusing but calming nonetheless. In the knitted hand fans, we embed peace messages such as forgiveness, justice, tolerance, respect for diversity, peace, and so on. As part of our efforts to promote peace building in vulnerable communities and to complement our non-punitive community peace building mechanisms, we create peace walls or peace murals in host communities. We begin by organizing community meetings where community members vote on what peace building value best represents them. After deciding on a peace value, such as tolerance, or forgiveness, or respect, the community leadership will choose a strategic wall in the community. We'll then engage an artist to draw a tree, a peace tree, and afterwards, we have an unveiling ceremony where community members write their chosen value in their respective dialects to enhance their sense of self-efficacy and to promote inclusivity. These are usually quite heterogeneous communities where multiple languages are spoken. The high level of heterogeneity in these host communities owe to the amounts of displacement from other more homogeneous communities affected by the Boko Haram and ISWAP insurgency. We hope you found this short video informative and will consider using expressive therapies to address trauma alongside other more standardized talk and activity-based therapeutic techniques.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Bie, and to you and your colleagues at NEEM. I invite you to make a few comments before we move over to Dr. Shali.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Here at NEEM Foundation, we've been doing this sort of work that we've just shown for well over half a decade. And it's such an absolute honor for us to be able to share it with the rest of you. What we have tried to do over the years is to take our knowledge informed by the global north about mental health and merge it with our indigenous knowledge of how we have addressed mental health issues over the centuries. And over the years, we've tried to perfect this by attending to both the academic informed approaches as well as the locally informed approaches, as you have seen in the video. Apologies if some of the images might have been a bit disturbing. This is because we walk in the context of conflict and would much rather show you smiley faces, but unfortunately, these are the sort of images that we're confronted with at the very start. So one good thing to take home about this is usually after we provide these services and after we have built the resilience in a lot of these community members, including children, we see a huge amount of improvement towards the end of the service provision. So that's one thing to take home. And I look forward to the discussions today. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Abie. And I think there will be many questions and comments at least. Dr. Charlie, I'm going to come over to you to give us some of your comments and thoughts as well before we open up. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Avier, and thank you to the NEEM Foundation team for sharing your incredible work with us and giving us this opportunity to learn more about the important and I think quite exemplary work that NEEM is doing in Nigeria, both in bringing peace building and mental health and psychosocial support together, and in using arts-based and creative approaches in peace building and mental health work. Mental health and peace building, I think, are just intimately connected. There's no peace without mental health and healthy relationships, and unaddressed mental health challenges pose very serious threats to violence prevention and living in peaceful coexistence. We're increasingly beginning to recognize and pay attention to how witnessing and experiencing violent conflict has a very detrimental effect on people's well-being and the relationships among human beings. And this short film that we've just watched from the NEEM Foundation has really brought all of that home, I think, in quite a visual way. Arts-based approaches are also growing in popularity, and the evidence base and support of arts-based psychosocial interventions in violence against women and human trafficking domains has grown very substantially over the past few years. And I think we can expect this to grow across other policy domains, including peace building, in the coming years. What stood out to me as particularly interesting about the use of arts-based approaches deployed by NEEM here in this video is that they serve multiple goals, from identification through to acknowledgement and expression, and on to management and recovery. And I think that's really interesting, not just in terms of the approach, but also how NEEM is using this approach. Another thing that I think is particularly noteworthy is the very holistic approach taken by NEEM, spanning both across the life course and genders, and including diverse sources of violence and conflict in communities into these very holistic programs. The film that we've just watched, I think, highlights the immense potential of arts-based approaches for identifying and addressing and preventing feelings of hatred, fear, and mistrust from spiraling into deeper cycles of violence in communities affected by armed conflict by working both at the individual and community levels. Armed conflict and war destroys so much more than the infrastructure around us and livelihoods. Conflict reaches deep into the social tapestry. It impacts both on connections between those strands in the tapestry and the integrity of the individual threads. And so the efforts to restore the damaged social fabric needs to include mental health and psychosocial support at an individual level, as well as communal and collective psychosocial interventions. And as NEEM's programs discussed here today showcase that so very, very well. The current evidence base indicates that arts and cultural programs can have success when they are locally led, based on an understanding of local cultural traditions and linked to wider reconciliation and recovery programs. And this, I think, is precisely the bedrock of what we've seen in NEEM's programs here, and what they're built on. And two aspects of NEEM's work, I think, in this respect are probably worth pulling out: their use of culturally adapted activities and programs, as well as the community-driven approaches that they're using. While arts-based approaches might inherently engage communities across cultural barriers and understandings, I think NEEM's work showcased here goes beyond this and deliberately pays close attention to culture and context in the development of their arts-based approaches. Culturally adapted interventions that include this kind of deep understanding of the context in which both violence and recovery are taking place, community understandings and experiences of mental health, as well as help-seeking and coping behaviors, can really improve trust and uptake and engagement in these kinds of interventions. And when interventions like this are really relevant for and resonate with communities, communities are empowered to address some of the underlying causes of violence and mental ill health and begin to work together towards sustainable peace. Similarly, I think engaged approaches such as those shown here by NEEM that foster community partnerships and use participatory approaches to generate community-driven goals and solutions have been shown across multiple violence reduction domains to improve the sustainability of interventions by empowering communities to support each other and to address the cycle of violence as a community-wide strategy. And just very finally, I want to say something a little bit more holistic about NEEM's approach rather than just the arts-based stuff that we've seen today. Historically, the impact of armed conflict on mental health has been addressed at a very individual level through mental health and psychosocial support. But these attempts to integrate mental health and psychosocial support and peace-building efforts, we're seeing increasing attention being paid to the community-wide aspects of peace building and psychosocial mental health support. And this is really a foundational thing to do for community resilience and conflict resolution and social cohesion. And so we're seeing a lot of theoretical agreement across the literature that peace building and mental health and psychosocial support should be brought together in intervention programs like we've just seen here today. Integrated mental health and psychosocial support and peace-building activities really have a potential to address the burden of mental health and break the vicious cycle of violence that violent extremism exacerbates in communities. There's a growing awareness that we need to bring these things together, but there have been a few systematic reviews which suggest that there aren't many good examples of fully integrated mental health and psychosocial support and peace-building programs. And the work presented here by NEEM is, I think, just an extraordinary example of how peace-building and mental health and psychosocial support can actually be integrated at every level, emphasizing in particular the importance of community partnerships to engage the community at multiple levels across the life cycle. I think just a final closing remark is to say that in our future research in this space, we need to start to look very carefully at the mechanisms behind these integrated approaches so that we can further understand the pathways to improved mental health and decreasing violence and violent extremism, and understanding just exactly what these kinds of integrated programs really have to offer. So once again, thank you to the NEEM Foundation and Dr. Abiye for sharing your extraordinary work with us today.
Excellent, excellent, Dr. Shali. Thank you so very much. I think really the two of you have really brought together and even answered some of the questions that I think the entire Africa Week had set out to try and start to get responses to. I think, Dr. Abiye, when you mentioned, I think in the beginning, that part of this program and part of this work is to bring ideas, approaches, therapies that are considered Western and maybe even a bit foreign into an African context where things are happening in different ways. And then I think, Dr. Shali, as you talk about how to marry these disciplines, how to marry peace building and mental health, and how this is a subject that academics are trying to are constantly grappling with. I think also, maybe just to add, that we also do see communities bringing these things together, even in the absence of organizations, in the absence of researchers or academics. And so I wonder what lessons are there in some of that. And to answer the question that you're asking, Dr. Shali, about the mechanisms, what do these mechanisms need to look like? How do we identify them where they may be happening organically in some of these contexts? Because we do know that communities do grapple with these very violent and traumatic events that happen to them or within their spaces, even in the absence of the United Nations or a peacekeeping mission or an INGO that may be able to document what is happening or what they're seeing. So I think really very fascinating things that are coming up. For our attendees, participants, the floor is open for questions. There are already a number of comments in the chat box, but I really would like to invite a couple of questions. You can please do ask your question, and we will allow you, please indicate if you have a question. We will allow you to comment or to say something. So please do go ahead. I don't see anything yet, but there is a comment from Simon Mundy. Welcome, Simon. Very good to have you on this webinar. Simon says that some of these techniques he's referring to other contexts where they've been implemented or practiced in the Congo. I imagine that's the DRC and other regions, Afghanistan, Brazil, and other countries. And then he is also referring to the use of poetry and how that has been used in peace and security or peace building settings. We have also a comment from Umar, who says expressive therapy is art. And evidently this helps our beneficiaries in positively expressing themselves, hence gaining emotional relief. And interestingly enough, it has also been shown to help in cognitive control. Thank you, Umar, for that comment. We do have a question in the Q&A, which is, I think, to both of you, but Dr. Shali first, that you have flagged such holistic approaches are rare and difficult to come by. So I'm interested in what challenges and tensions NEEM have had to navigate to offer this. I'm also interested in whether these interventions carry on until after NEEM move on to other spaces. And maybe, Dr. Abia, I would even add to that, how communities receive the idea of dealing with mental health, which we know in many communities, in some cultures, is taboo, actually, to talk about mental health. But Dr. Abia, to you first, and then Shali, if you could offer some of your thoughts. And participants, please remember the floor is open for questions. Please do pop them in the chat or the Q&A. Over to you, Dr. Abia.
Thank you very much. That's such an important question. I'll start with the last few question, given the stigma associated with seeking help for mental health issue. Before we go to any community, we consider advocacy and sensitization as a very, very important part of the work. And so what we do is that we approach community members and community stakeholders at large and give them some form of psychoeducation on the effects of mental health challenges. We let them know that mental health challenges are not just a myopic view of a mental health challenge that we have, which some people will think of as psychosis. We let them know that mental health is just the same thing as physical health. And as much as physical health can range from a mild headache to full-blown cancer, it can be the exact same thing for mental health. When we go to many of these communities, keep in mind that many of the community members have been directly or indirectly affected by the conflict. When we start speaking to them about symptoms of trauma, symptoms of PTSD, for instance, the hypervigilance, the general anxiety, the nightmares, and so the general recall of the conflict, it doesn't take much to convince them, because these very people are experiencing the same things. It's as though we speak in the same language as them. We're telling them what they feel every day. We're telling them what they're not able to tell other people. We're telling them what they're not able to speak about in public. And so once we form this bond with the community members and we gain their trust, by telling them about the symptoms, and they agree themselves that they have been experiencing the symptoms, and we manage to break the stigma associated with seeking the help of a mental health professional. And from there onwards, it's quite easy to get the beneficiaries onto the program, or participants onto the program. In many of the communities that we go, after we finish this sensitization, advocacy, and psychoeducation, and when we arrive in the community, we find sometimes hundreds of people trying to get in through the door to receive our services. In terms of using the expressive therapies, and there are quite a range of them, one thing we keep in mind first and foremost is to respect the culture of the particular communities that we work in, to respect the culture and the religious sensibilities of that particular community. We might want to implement an expressive therapy using dance, for instance, and if the community stakeholders, if the community leadership is against this, then we wouldn't do it. We would look for an alternative. Similarly, we go to many communities where community members might frown upon mixing genders together when we provide services. As soon as we hear of this complaint, and most times we're proactive to ask them what their sensibilities are, what can we do and what can we not do, and try and work around it, because we know that it's very important to get the buy-in of the community. Without the buy-in of the community, there will be no sustainability. And this ties in directly to the question that was asked about sustainability. I'll go to that next, but still on how the challenges of implementing these expressive therapies in communities. I'll use the peace murals, the peace walls that we showed in the video, for instance. When we first came up with this idea, we wanted to use an image of a dove, of a peace dove, a sign, a general recognized sign of peace on these walls. However, when we started talking with the community stakeholders, keeping in mind that a lot of these communities are very religious, and we discovered that it went against their religion to draw animate objects on the wall. So we could have gone back home, packed our bags and gone back home, or given up on that particular project. But we had to go back and think about what we could do differently, to make this a success. So within that challenge, we came up with something new. We decided to draw a tree, and within that challenge from the tree, we decided to choose a piece. Earlier, we wanted to draw peace murals, which is one word, which is peace in a dove. But with this challenge, we had to go back and think about drawing a tree. And then we came up with the idea of choosing a value, peace, tolerance, and forgiveness, and getting every community, every dialect spoken in that community represented in that word. And so these were drawn as leaves on the tree. So within this challenge, we found a new opportunity that was way better than what we had in mind before, given that many of these communities, many different languages are spoken, and we didn't just want to write the value in just English and the dominant language, two dominant languages there are Hausa and Kanuri, but you have many other languages. You have Goza, you have Chibok, you have Shua Arab, and so forth. So this brought an additional benefit to the program, where we would see other people from minority ethnic groups in the community represented and having to go up and write the peace value in their own dialect. And so we were quite pleased with how this turned out. And in terms of sustainability, these expressive therapy approaches are only complementary to the talk therapy that we provide through one-on-one counseling and group counseling. What we do in communities towards the closeout of our service provision in these communities, we form support groups made up of 10 to 12 people in each group. And we encourage these community members, these group members, to continue meeting after we leave the community. And we go back to the community once in a while to provide support for them. And now, through our flagship program, Counseling Wills, where most of these images have come from, over the years, we have formed over 1,000 support groups in various communities. So far, we've been in over 50 communities. We've seen over 30,000 individuals over the years. And so we have thousands of support groups in various communities. What we did towards the end of the program is that we were able to work with our donor or funder and convince them on the need to build safe spaces in these communities. And so we're able to do this in a number of communities where we liaised with the community stakeholders. A piece of land, a neutral piece of land was given to us, and we built neutral spaces in the communities that did not belong to anyone, where every community member or where these groups, these support groups can come to meet. So that's how we approach the sustainability issue. Thank you.
Excellent, really fascinating, really fascinating stuff. Dr. Shali, please.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, my internet is being a bit dodgy, so if I drop out, please let me know through a message. Okay. Yeah, I guess I can't speak to NEEM's challenges that they've had specifically, and maybe Dr. Abia can say more once I've spoken. We can just have a conversation a little bit. But I guess this happens in a number of different policy domains in terms of challenges for developing holistic programs like this. And what I can say is a couple of things. One is disciplinary isolation. And so people like to talk about interdisciplinarity a lot, but in practice, it's very difficult to get people to work across disciplines in ways that truly bring different things together. But it's also quite difficult to get funding for interdisciplinary projects quite often because things are very siloed. They want to address either mental health or peace building, and it's difficult to convince people that we need to do both of these together. So that's where big challenges come in, I think. And then there are also enormous costs involved in running holistic programs. So integrating very important things like we saw in the video from Dr. Abia, bringing issues of violence against women, which is essential because these community level violences play a big role in the bigger story. Bringing things in for that adds costs on, which funders often don't want to pay for because they're looking at a program on either mental health support or murals. And so developing enough funding to run holistic programs is a big challenge. But then another challenge that's faced in making these programs is expertise. So having one group to run programs that are holistic is having expertise across multiple domains, and many organizations simply aren't big enough or don't have the expertise to do that and need to run referral systems onto different things. And I suppose NEEM has just done a great job of being able to overcome these challenges, and I'm not sure how they've done it. There are very few examples of people who have managed to overcome those challenges. So it would be nice to know how NEEM is managing to address those.
Thanks. Before I come back to you, Dr. Abia, we have a number of other comments and questions in the chat and in the Q&A. And maybe this will be, we'll take this round and maybe then one more. But so Dr. Abia, please keep that question back, just keep it in your back pocket. But Dr. Shadi, maybe I bring this one to you, which is specific, and I think you sort of alluded to it in some of your earlier remarks. And the question is, how can we integrate mental health and psychosocial support into transitional justice mechanisms? And I think as you started talking about, issues around reconciliation, around, around justice, around accountability, knowing, perpetrators, I think both you and Dr. Abia also kind of alluded to that generally. So maybe you could touch on that a little bit. There was a question around funding, but I think Dr. Shali, you've already addressed that, but it was about how easy is it to persuade funders about this type of work. And then Simon again is talking about how the role of researchers such as both of yourselves and practitioners as well, clinicians, in working with agencies like UNDP, the World Bank, to fund local organizations or local NGOs doing this kind of work, because it's very needed. And then there's just a final comment here from Khorata, who is saying, wow, she loves the work that NEEM does, that for her as a criminologist, she's only beginning to learn about expressive therapies, but how they offer an alternative to the kind of retributive or punitive kind of justice that is often, what from a criminology type of perspective would be in place. And really, this has been a great learning for her. So maybe if I can just put those two broad sets of comments, questions on the table. And Dr. Shali, I'll start with you, and then we'll go back to Dr. Abiye.
Yeah, sure. Okay. I think it's quite a big question to ask. How can we integrate mental health and psychosocial support into transitional justice mechanisms? But I guess what we're seeing is that it's not dissimilar to the work being done here in integrating mental health and psychosocial support with peace building. And I think if we think about transitional justice mechanisms, we can see that the ultimate goals of mental health and psychosocial support and transitional justice mechanisms look like they're probably come together in many ways. They are trying to achieve very similar aims. And so there's probably very similar ways that we could think about integrating these activities to try and meet those common goals across those spaces. So I think it would look fairly similar to what we're trying to do in the peace building space. And again, the transitional justice space is within that broader peace building framework too. So I think that work that's been done in South Africa in particular with the post-TRC work, not TRC work, but post-TRC work, probably has some great insights into thinking about how we can start that work, but we're not there yet. And so I think that would be a great place to have a look at where to go. The other question was about the role of researchers, which I think is a great question, and I think is so important. And this is one of the reasons that we are really trying to drive our partnership with NEEM even further at the moment, to get the work of NEEM out there into different spaces so that we can make some good policy cases. And I agree that that's exactly what we need to do. There is currently a document out by UNDP for comment from us as researchers and practitioners. So we are feeding into those documents, and that's definitely our role. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dr. Abiye.
Thank you. So I think the two questions are somewhat related, right? Dr. Shaw's question about funding, and there's a question, a Q&A about funding as well. I think how we get around this, a lot of it has to do, has to attribute a lot of it to our executive director, Dr. Fatima Akilu. For the next comments I would make now. So it's not easy getting funding to merge mental health and peace building. But I think to make a difference in this sort of job, you have to consider it as more than a job. You have to be quite passionate about it. With these sorts of humanitarian and development type projects, it's very easy to stick to a set of targets that the funder has given you. And if you just do that, really it's a box ticking exercise, right? So you get the money, you go to the communities, you implement, you tick all the right boxes, and then you move on to the next project. But a lot of the times you've not done anything new, and you've not created an impact, a lasting impact, and so forth. So at NEEM, we do it differently. At NEEM, we always, for every project, we always have two sets of targets. We have one target for the funder. We'll make sure we tick all the boxes that they have asked, but we also hold ourselves at NEEM to a much higher standard. So we have our own targets as well, and we know what we want to do in the communities that we go to implement many of these projects. And having that passion alone and having this higher set of standards, I think, provides the right kind of environment for innovation and creativity in addressing many of these things. And also at the very early stage, having some sort of expert knowledge and competence in the subject matter, especially when you get the opportunity to speak with funders beforehand about the projects. And that's the opportunity that you get to make the linkage between mental health and peace building, as it were. But even when you don't have the opportunity to make this linkage, when you start implementing the project, you can look for opportunities to merge it. For instance, if you're implementing sort of a purely peace building projects in a community affected by conflicts, when you go to host this community meetings, to speak with community members, you can't deny the fact that many of the people in that room, in this meeting, would have been survivors of the conflict, right? So either primary survivors or secondary survivors. And you're here in this room, you're talking to them about forgiveness, and you're talking to them about peace. And we all know the group thinking effects of conformism, for instance, right? So people that might not agree to the peace building remarks and the tolerance remarks could agree because everyone is agreeing with it. They might not want to stand out. And everyone agrees on that table, and everybody goes back home to the prejudice and to the anger and intolerance and everything. But what you can do differently is that you can make a case to the donors and that these people that you're speaking to are primary and secondary victims, and that you need to validate their traumatic experiences. And that's what we do differently with all our peace building meetings. We validate their traumatic experiences. We're talking about a community member that's lost a son, a mother that's lost her children. Oh, we don't say, oh, just forget about that. Let's talk about peace. We validate their feelings. We recognize that they've lost children. We recognize that they've lost the property and so forth, and start from there and try and get them in the right headspace and address the traumatic experiences before we begin to talk about peace building. Right. And so this goes back to the funding and implementing the projects. Right. And so if your funder is just interested in how many people come to the meeting, for instance, you're meant to carry out 5 meetings. And in each of those 5 meetings, you're meant to have 20 people. You can easily do that and show them the register with 20 people, all 5 meetings, and gives the donor. But if you hold yourself to higher standards, as long as you do not exceed the budget line for these programs, and as long as you do not use the money for something completely different, you can justify it within your circle that having these first set of meetings to validate the traumatic experiences is an important part of the peace building process. I think I can talk on and on about this. I'll just try and keep it short. But one way to overcome this is to have sort of two sets of deliverables, one to your funders and another one that's internal, that's much more better because you understand the context much more than your funders ever could. Thank you.
Really, really, really wonderful comments and insights, I think, coming through from both of you. I'm going to take, I think, a last round of questions or comments. If you would like to take the floor and to speak, please indicate so. There is also a room that has a number of people. Adeoti, if there's anyone there who'd also like to speak or to ask a question, please provide them the opportunity to do so. But even as we do that and wait for that, I just want to ask the two of you as both practitioners, researchers, clinicians, what is a question that is vexing you at this point in your work, in your approaches, having all this experience that you both have, Dr. Shali a lot from Southern Africa, Dr. Abir from Northern Nigeria, something that vexes you, something that you've noticed, something that you'd be interested even in some of the young researchers who are on this call or part of this webinar today, that they might be inspired to go and do more research on or to investigate further. So that's just a question from me as we wait for maybe 1 or 2 last questions and comments. I don't know who'd like to go first. Dr. Abie, would you like to go first?
Okay, thank you. Well, in terms of questions, a question I keep asking myself over and over again when I go to the field is, is when will it end? I think that's a question, that we all ask ourselves. In terms of research, I think we need more tools. We need more psychometric tools. We need more tools that speak to the people themselves, as opposed to using standardized tools. When we consider standardized tools, we have to ask ourselves, like, what population were these tools standardized for? Certainly not the populations that we're working with. And so over the years of doing this work and collecting data, I think we need young researchers that can put together all these forms of data and come up with truly contextualized tools that address some of the common mental health issues and other issues associated with conflicts. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Dr. Shali?
Yeah, I think Dr. Abie has asked the really important question around the tools that we use and how we can get community-driven tools, even people with lived experience-driven tools is a big thing that I'm really starting to think about at the moment. So people should be working on that. I think starting to map out what works for who in what contexts and why is probably the next biggest thing that I'm thinking about. We're seeing a lot of approaches now using that realist-based thinking around interventions. And I think this is one of the spaces that really needs that sort of thinking. So young researchers on this call, if you're going to go off and do something, let's get some realist thinking into this space to understand the mechanisms of change that are happening here. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I've just had indication that we have 2 questions from the room. Adeoti, I don't know if you would like to give the mic or the floor to the 2 individuals with questions, and then we can, those will be our last questions. Adeoti?
Sorry. Give me a second.
Also, as we wait for Adeoti, I think this is a specific question to you, Dr. Abie. Eka is interested in the way that crafting, making, and producing activities are drawn into this. So with the hats and the fans, what inspired these choices and what happens with these outputs? Are they used locally, regionally, nationally? So how far do they go? While Adeoti tries to get the room technology working.
Thank you very much. What inspired it is our desire for messaging mediums to be functional, right? And then this goes back to what I was saying before. So for instance, in this particular project, we had funding for messaging, right? And so traditionally, what we would have done would have been to design flyers, right? Would have been to design flyers with peace messaging, handbills, and so forth. And then using from our personal experience, using from my own personal experience, when I receive handbills, I hardly read them. And even when I read them, I discard them afterwards. And so really passionate about putting messages in functional mediums, something that you can't show away, something that is right there in front of you every day. It's even better if you use it every day. It's right there in front of you. So that really was one of the genesis that really inspired it, and that merged into, in many of these communities, they already have a tradition of knitting these traditional hats, of knitting these hand fans and mats and so forth. And so we just tied everything in together. And so you see how you can, so what I was saying before, as long as you're doing the same thing, as long as you're doing what the donor wants, the funder wants, The funder in this particular case, the funder wanted us to give out peace messaging in the communities. And what they had in mind were flyers. But we did it differently. We still did the peace messaging, but we did it through functional objects. And while doing it through functional objects, we're able to do mindfulness and embed mental health and psychosocial support into that component. So we killed, as it were, many birds with just one stone. But then again, like I said, if you approach this as just a job waiting for your salary at the end of the month, you're not going to be able to make all these connections. But if you're passionate about it and you go home thinking about it, then you'd look for ways to make all these connections together. In terms of the items that they produce, we give them back to the communities that we implement them in. So we don't sell them or anything, we give them back to the communities. Now, if this was a livelihood support project, some of which we have, then we would use a business approach model. The video just shows images from one particular program, our flagship program, Counseling and Wills, but we have many other programs at NEEM Foundation where we use various other techniques. I see that poetry is mentioned. We have another program that uses poetry in the communities, and this is purely peace building community, and we use radio a lot and so forth. We have a learning center for girls specifically, where we teach everything that's in the Nigerian curriculum, but we go a step further. The whole learning process is trauma informed. So we have counselors and we have psychologists in the school. We use a lot of art-based approaches. We use a lot of computer coding in these communities and so forth. So if it was a livelihood support component, then we would use a business approach model. And we have implemented programs like this in the past, where we would group participants, beneficiaries into cooperatives and register them as businesses and give them some startup money to continue making this and educate them on the value chain for their products. Thank you.
Wow, very, a lot of information here and many threads, I think, that are stemming from this. I think there are two of the comments that or questions that have come from the room where Adeoti is, where there are a number of people, as well as one of our master's classes. The first question is, are there any risks in pathologizing victims and potentially implying a risk of cyclical engagement in violence by survivors where there is not a prevailing trend, and that this may result in stigmatization rather than the opposite? A related question is in the danger of resorting to PTSD approaches, where we are actually talking about contexts of ongoing conflict and continuous exposure rather than just incidental events. So that's the first question. The second question is from Natasha. So I think the first one is from Dr. Graham Simpson, who's also in the room. And then the second one is from Natasha, who asks, you mentioned a delineation between pure peace building and pure mental health. Whilst we appreciate that interdisciplinary work needs to take place, what frameworks, if any, do you employ to demonstrate that these boundaries are not as rigid? So I will actually just ask both Dr. Abie and Dr. Shali to respond to these questions in whichever way you feel and whichever order you would like to. Just some of your thoughts, reactions to these two very complex and very packed questions that will end us off today. So I'll start with you, Dr. Shali, and then you can also give us just some of your rounding of thoughts as you do that as well.
Sure. Okay. I'm not sure how much I can say in just a few minutes, but I'll do what I can. So just on the first question, in terms of risks of pathologizing victims, I mean, I think that's always going to be a risk in this kind of work. There is, I've done quite a bit of work with NEEM, but I'm sure Dr. Avia will talk more about this in terms of the extensive training that is done with the community health workers who are working in the Counseling on Wheels program. And I think that is quite an important aspect of getting around this particular danger. But I think also just my own reflection from watching this video today, which I think everyone will have seen, is that the approach taken here is one of listening first and seeing where people are at and responding to that. So it's definitely not an approach of going in and saying everyone in this community has all of these mental health challenges and therefore they are at risk of falling into violent extremism and perpetuating the cycle of violence. I think that's definitely not the approach that is being taken here. So I think that listening first is the critical thing that's happening with NEEM. And I guess what we've seen today, I'm rounding off these kind of closing remarks at the same time. And I suppose what we've seen today in these arts-based approaches is just how effective they are in using that listening first approach and assessing where people are at and seeing, you know, who is possibly at risk of getting struck into cycles of violence and who might need different kinds of support and how. So I think that was really interesting from what we saw today. I'm not sure if I've addressed everything from that question. I think there was an issue around the danger of resorting to PTSD approaches, where actually we're talking about contexts of ongoing conflict. Again, I think there is a tendency to resort to PTSD approaches in many intervention programs. It's one of the things that's most measured in many violence programs. And so there is that tendency. I'll let Dr. Abier speak more to that because he's got a deeper understanding of the NEEM programs themselves. I think that what is possibly important to note about the context is that there is a mixture of ongoing conflict and communities that are trying to resettle after conflict. So there's a bit of a mixture there as well. And that's probably important to think about. Now, the question from Natasha, thank you for this question. It's a really good question. I think I didn't want to imply in what I was saying that there is such a thing as pure peace building and such a thing as pure psychosocial mental health support. At the same time, these two things have been separated out into disciplines that don't necessarily speak to each other very clearly. And I think a lot of the literature at the moment is thinking about how to bring these two disparate approaches together. And you're saying you appreciate that interdisciplinary work needs to take place. What frameworks do we employ to demonstrate that these boundaries are not as rigid? I don't think that there's a framework that says there's any specific framework to say that these boundaries are not as rigid. But Dr. Abier mentioned just in his previous answer, the ways in which we are starting to think about how these two different fields actually are not as different as we might think they are in terms of the goals and the processes and the methods that we're using. And I think those frameworks that you're asking for are precisely what are being developed right now. And it's the theoretical work that needs to go into it and is happening at the moment, whereas NEEM is leading with programs that are doing the work ahead of some of those theoretical frameworks, so to speak, that are a little bit academic. So I'll hand over to Dr. Abier.
Thank you very much. I think the two questions are very, very important questions. I will start with the first in terms of pathology. Participants, community, the members. One thing that we sort of did differently, and which Dr. Kilu made a case for with our funders, was training. And so in many of our programs, we have quite intensive training. And the counseling roles program that I just showed a video of, none of the counselors or psychologists work on Fridays. Every single Friday is dedicated to training and case conferences. All right. And through those trainings, we invite experts from all around the world to come and train. And thankfully, most times this is done on a pro bono basis, where they come and they train our counselors. So we take training very, very seriously so that they understand the positions that they're in to go to these communities and speak to these community members. Secondly, is the language that we use. Throughout NEEM Foundation, we don't use the word victims. We use survivors, for instance, because we believe that language is very important of even how we frame these community members in our minds. As part of the training, especially when we onboard new staff, we repeat it to them over and over again that when they go to these communities, a lot of the beneficiaries or participants that we'll be working with were once very successful businessmen, and businesswomen, some teachers, nurses, and so forth in the various communities that have been displaced and now in either IDP camps or host communities and now dependent on humanitarian aid and government aid. So we let them know that it's very important to put this at the back of your mind when you go to the communities and when you speak with these people, to always know that and never see them as displaced peoples living in the community, dependent, but see them just the way they were before. Because a lot of our approach that we use is strength-based, right? So when we speak to any individual, what we try to do is figure out what their strengths are and try and enhance it or remind them of who they used to be if they had forgotten. Lastly, one of the things that we do differently is that in this space, especially when we first started, the other organizations that were providing mental health support, I was opportune to seek some of their reports and speak to some of the counselors and psychologists. And especially in the early days, no one was using psychometric tools. It was just the basis of interacting with the community members. And I'll keep in mind that a lot of people that were doing this job were not trained as psychologists, or not trained as counselors even. In some organizations, they might receive a week's training or 2 weeks training before they go to the field. And I have interviewed many people that have applied for jobs as counselors at NEEM Foundation with experience in other organizations who have not received any training. They don't have no certification in any mental health related course. They've received no training on the job, nothing, but they've gone to communities to provide mental health and psychosocial supports. And they're the ones coming up with all these reports that these number of people have depression, and these number of people have PTSD, and so forth. And so that's something that we recognized very early and tried to address through the various trainings that we have. But also, it was a little bit of a catch-22. Earlier, we mentioned the limitations of using standardized tools, because these standardized tools were not developed for the populations that we work with. But nonetheless, they have their own uses as well, given that they have been validated. The tools that we use have been validated across various countries. And so even though it might not have been validated for that specific population, a lot of them have been validated in other countries in the global south. And so we use some of these tools as well. And so that when we report that, for instance, certain number of people have depression or severe depression and so forth, it is not the counselors themselves that are saying it, but these are the results from the standardized tool. We're keeping in mind the limitations of the standardized tool. What we've also done differently is that as much as we've used the standardized tool, we've also created room for a lot of qualitative data collection. So we have a lot of qualitative data that we have collected from thousands of people. As you're aware, I'm sure, you know that the basis of this data that we've collected from thousands and thousands of people on the Northeast, this is from one of the bases for our partnership with King's College. And one of the things that we're looking forward to is for students and researchers to be able to see through this qualitative data to figure out how depression, anxiety, stress, and PTSD and so forth affect community members in this particular context differently from people in the global north, for instance. Having said that, even when we use standardized psychometric tools, We train our counselors and our psychologists on how to administer it and how to speak it in the local language. There's a consensus amongst all the counselors. So one counselor is not interpreting it in one way, another person a different way. We'll make sure there's consensus in the room. And then for certain words that might not be applicable in that particular context. For instance, we have tools that you have a rating, for instance, of feeling butterflies in your stomach. Now, this is not a term that we use commonly here. And so if we were to go to the communities and ask them about having butterflies in the stomach, it might be misunderstood. And so when we see things like this, words like this, so forth, we'll make sure that we have a session to really understand what it means and then figure out how to say it in a context that the people we work with will understand. And moving on to the next question, the delineation between peace building and mental health. I think this is really artificially imposed as a result of the programs that are funded. So traditionally, you would have a funder who's only interested in peace building, and you'd have a funder who's only interested in mental health support. Now, usually these funders are not interested enough to fund projects because it does not fit into their interests. Say, for instance, a peace building organization, even though they might be interested in mental health, it might not fit into their aims and objectives. And so they will just fund purely peace building. And the same thing with mental health approaches. I think that this is what has formed the divide, and it's artificial because it's imposed this way. But really, the divide is not much, especially when you're working in the communities affected by conflicts. More so after the conflicts, because you're working with people who have been either primarily or secondarily affected by the conflicts. But even so, in early warning programs, when the conflict has not happened yet, you still can't ignore the little aspects of mental health and things like anger management and things like social emotional intelligence and so forth will come into play. So it's really, there is no divide between the two, even though each of them are quite fairly well established and disciplined. Thank you.
Wow, I feel like we have really had quite a rich but a very a discussion that has moved us along. I feel like we were along a river and we're moving along that river with different things happening along the way, and it's been incredibly rich. I think the insights from both of you, Dr. Abir, Dr. Shali, really incredible, and expanded some of our thinking, especially those of us who don't ordinarily occupy the space or exist in the world of mental health and psychosocial support, or even of peace building. So I think on both ends, there's been quite a bit of enrichment. The comments and the questions from participants, thank you so very much. I think you have lent yourselves well to this conversation, and clearly we could have another 2 hours of a discussion about it. I think it would be really interesting to even delve further into the use of art and expressive therapies, but I think there's just quite a lot to discuss on this subject. I think both Dr. Abir and Dr. Shali have also given a challenge to those on the call, those doing research, those whose research intersects with some of what we've been discussing today. So it would be interesting to see what comes out of it. Thank you so very much to the two of you, our discussants. Thank you to NEEM Foundation. Thank you to IOPPN. And thank you. We look forward to having more conversations with the two of you, and also to bringing in other organizations, maybe from other regions, other parts of the world even, who are doing similar work, to see what more and how much further we could take some of this conversation. Eka, I give that to you to maybe think about as well. So thank you so much, everyone. We wish you the best, NEEM, as you continue with your programming and your work, and we look forward to engaging with many more of you throughout the rest of King's Africa Week. Thank you so much for joining us. Please join in the other events taking place, and I wish you all a very good rest of the afternoon and a good weekend. Please stay safe and take great care. Thank you, thank you, thank you.